This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know, and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what?
All right. We're back.
We're back.
We've been away. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
We've been away, both literally and figuratively.
Where have you been? Where have we been?
We went to Florida.
How's Florida? Well, I was there.
Warmer. Yeah. What are you asking me for? You were there, but we had a little bit of a different experience there.
Yeah, I took my sarongs. I bought a little bit of Southeast Asia to Florida. Mm-hmm. I got a few looks.
I don't even have. I can't even. So one of the things that I love about you is the way that you sort of pick and choose the ways that your sort of culture of origin and adopted cultures from your life experience, you sort of plug them in different parts of your world as if. So for example, you will say things like, I don't need a beach chair. People from Australia don't do that.
I don't know if I said Australia.
Well, you said something about like, they just sit on the sand. Now, I've been to Australia many times, and I've been to the beach.
Uh-huh.
They sit on chairs just like other people do.
I don't remember it.
It's very strange, your memory. I could just tell you that Italian girls from New Jersey do not sit directly on the sand without a towel or, preferably a chair.
Right.
Anyway, this is just a bizarre start to a podcast.
What else has been going on with you?
I submitted my thesis yesterday at 3:03 p.m.
But it just got accepted, right?
From the library, the formal sort of acceptance of the formatting for publication.
What's the difference? What's the process?
What do you mean?
Well, why does the library accept it? You know, that part.
It goes into the permanent archives. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So you're done.
Yeah, I'm done. I can't actually believe it. 4 years.
It's incredible.
4 years.
Tell us about the journey.
We just talked. It was interesting. We talked about this last night. We took a little break because once my submission happened, I went to the woods. I just had to go to the woods with the dog, and then we went out to dinner because I couldn't actually think. There was nothing left. There's just a little bit of mush. The process has been a long one. So, it's really interesting because the program is pretty intense. It's a terminal master's. It took 4 years, and it's a series of 8-week intensives. So it's 3 years of coursework, and then however long it takes to write the thesis, which is long.
Well, you turned into a dynamic, focused monster and pumped it out.
Well, and the thing is that over the course of the last 4 years, those classes, it's really interesting to think about sort of how much having a system is really important. I know I joke about this, but someone on our team said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were organized or used a spreadsheet." And I was just like, wait, for real? And it has stuck with me as kind of almost the most random thing that has ever been said to me, which probably not. But the amount of structure that I have built into how I manage my world, but like for the 3 years when I had coursework, every Saturday, so Fridays at midnight, the week's work would open, and I would get up at 5:30 on a Saturday morning, download all of the PDFs of the material, find all of the reading that I had to do for the week, set a schedule for how I was going to manage it, and then I had a paper due every Friday. So like a paper would be due Friday by midnight, and the next tranche of materials would dump at midnight. So it was a lot. I mean, when I think back on it, it was a lot.
No, I can confirm that.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
And can I just say the one thing that was really funny?
Capital A.
Yeah. And capital L. I mean, because a lot is 2 words, even though people like to put it as 1 word. Right. There we go. There's another strange custom that you claim to have adopted. I tried. Do you remember that I tried for one of my courses to use paper? Because I actually prefer paper. I really struggle. For those of you who have seen my face, I wear big glasses because my vision is challenged. And I really struggle with all the digital, I've had to have so much screen time. And I tried, do you remember one of the courses I tried to use paper?
No, what happened?
Oh my
Actually,
God.
don't remember.
I killed a forest. It was unbelievable because I printed everything out. That's when we bought that. We bought a cheap print, or one, you called it the workhorse printer, where we could print hundreds of pages. And I was literally printing hundreds of pages a week. And then my office was like littered with these stacks and sticky notes everywhere. And I was like, forget it, I can't. I just can't do it. I just recycled all of that paper. I needed a wheelbarrow to get it out. I don't know how people can do that anymore.
So what have you, have you learned skills?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. What are the skills, forget about the content, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what are the skills you've learned?
So I want to say that the biggest takeaway for me is that let me think about how to say this, because I'm thinking about writing the thesis. And there's almost a formula that it took me a really long time to recognize. And the formula is sort of this is what I'm going to say. Here's how I'm going to say it. These are all the other people who have said it in one way or another. I'm adding to the conversation with an analysis of this information and then summing up, this is what has been said. And this is the longest format that I've ever done in this way. I had a prologue, an introduction, which was a lot of background, sources and methods, 3 chapters, each of which had, sections in it. Then the epilogue and the conclusion. And there's a way in which sort of the remembering of all of the information, the flow, making sure there's no repetition, it's kind of a lot. And I realized that sort of what appeared to be formulaic to me in writing shorter format papers then became really important in a long format, because your reader has to remember what's already been told. And even though you become a subject matter expert, it's hard for other people to remember all of the things that have been newly introduced. And it's funny because as I now think back to how hard it was for me in the very beginning of my coursework, it was that I didn't have reference points for the ancien regime in history. I didn't even know what that meant. Do you know what I mean? Like, it took me a minute.
Right.
And
in other words, you kind of found, so what am I doing in this department? Because
it was all new. It was brand spanking new. And so that when I wrote my thesis and sent it to my advisor, to whom my material was brand spanking new, his feedback was so important, because he would say, I don't know what this means. I don't know what this word means.
Which is common to you.
Totally common to me.
Right.
And that's actually what I think, while it's still fresh, there is this way in which I'm sitting in the brackish water of what happened in 19th century medicine, where homeopaths walked away with their own sort of knowledge and assumptions and narrative, and the Orthodox folks walked away with their assumptions and narrative, each of whom has an opinion of each other as if totally separate, and that's not true. They were brackish waters. And I am still sort of stunned by how much of what has come through in the game of telephone in homeopathy really doesn't match history.
Well, it doesn't. Can I just change that?
Yeah, sure.
Well, it doesn't match the primary sources that you've been diving through.
Yeah.
And am I right? Because I want you to talk about this, because it seems to me, because I've had a sneak peek and a glance and a bit of a read of what you've been writing, and it doesn't match the existing historiography I know what that word means. That
Yeah.
means the history that's been written by the historians.
Yes.
And I'm stonkingly amazed by that.
Me too.
Can I ask you something, though, before we get to that?
Yeah.
Because you said something, and I just want to reiterate this, dear listener, because Denise is weird. Let me tell you.
Oh, great!
Oh,
I
yeah.
can't. How weird!
I just want to just say this because, I mean, and I'm speaking from my own experience, but I've watched and actually read quite a bit about writers. You know, writers often are reflective people, and in interviews you'll hear a writer talk about how they write. Mm-hmm. You know, and or musicians actually. I think for some reason once on YouTube I found Mahler. You know, a documentary on Mahler. And he would walk out of the house every day, walk down to the bottom of the garden to his little rotunda, and he would sit and write music. And then he'd get up at 10:30, he'd walk back to the house for his cup of tea, and he'd walk back down. You know, there's just things about writers that are quirky. And what's amazing to me about you, and I did not know this until really the last, say, 3 months, and definitely the last 4 weeks, is that what you write is complete. It's almost as if it doesn't need a draft. Now, I know you sent it for comments, but that's part of an academic process. But what comes out of your head is it's done, and it flows. Now, from experience...
Yeah, I've read your work.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, I don't know that you've seen me... Because you've not seen me write any of those books, have you? Because it's chaotic.
Yeah.
And it's like... Because it's spoken, it's a paragraph here, that gets moved up there, then it gets split in half, and that gets moved to that chapter, and you know, it's a very different process that requires 285 drafts.
Yeah.
And yours doesn't. It's astonishing.
And I don't have context because that's just how I work. But I'm also, when I'm in it, and there's no talking to me about anything else.
Yeah, right. It reminds me of Shelby Foote.
Oh, gosh. Have you talked on the podcast about Shelby Foote?
No. Shelby Foote is, you probably know if you're in these parts, or some people probably don't know. Now, he was born in 1932. He's an American writer. He calls himself a novelist, but he's not really. He's a historian, and he wrote those 3 amazing books about the Civil War. And he began in 1954 and he finished in 1974. Took him 20 years, and it's 1.5 million words. Oh
my gosh,
incredible! And anyway, long story short, he's the amazing Southern voice in Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War.
Yeah,
and I think that's now, is that 90s or early 2000s?
I have no idea.
20 years
I
ago.
didn't even know about it till you mentioned it.
Oh, it's incredible! I'm watching it for the second time again.
I know.
And so Shelby Foote, in an interview, just described how he writes, and it's how you write. It's almost, but he uses a quill.
I would use a quill if I could. Are you
Cursive.
kidding? But I think, in all fairness, that was how I earned my living before becoming a homeopath, was as a writer.
Right.
And so it's like, it's just a part of my, it's a part of my process. And also, I think being a reader, I would hide as a child in the basement to not have to go to summer camp so that I could read. I had a flashlight. I just would, it's just part of my geek nature. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that.
Well, I want to talk about that because you need to contextualize that, because that sounds like you're in like Harry Potter, unlocked under the thing. But you would hide, because summer camp for you would be a day trip, right?
Yeah, it was, and I didn't want to go. I would rather stay home and read books.
But you couldn't read up in the public part of the house. You'd have to hide, right?
Well, because I would pretend I went to camp and I would just stay and read books. Anyway, but so this.
All right, don't talk about that.
No. But process is really important.
Yeah.
And I think, so there are a couple things that I was thinking about along the way that, homeopathy students, or homeopathy is really hard. And I think it has been made harder because people it's been a game of telephone where charismatic teachers along the way have put their own spin on it and made it into now 50 million things as opposed to one thing. Now, what complicates that is that it is one thing, but that one thing that Hahnemann created over the course of his lifetime, right? So when we put him into historical context, he was born 1755, lives to 1843, but homeopathy really had its heyday sort of just before and in, say, the 25 years after Hahnemann died.
Got it.
Hahnemann was trying to put the brakes on some changes, but he died even before the Homeopathic Medical College of Pennsylvania really was started. It was started after Hahnemann died. So there was the Allentown Academy, which was a postgraduate educational experience taught in German to doctors already. That folded a year after Hahnemann died. And then there were 7 years. I might have my dates a little bit off.
I think it didn't last till 1837 because of the crash. But they still pumped out some diplomas after that.
Yeah, and Hahnemann was asking for the diploma for Melanie.
That's right. And so that's got to be 1841.
Yeah. So, because there were 7 years of no homeopathy education in America.
Right.
So whatever that date is. But the reason I say this is because Hahnemann was already saying, hey, there's new scientific information coming in. Be selective with it. Don't set it aside, but be selective. Don't leave this philosophy built on the universal laws, built on the laws of nature that can be applied to the human. Don't leave that aside in favor of new, shiny, reductionistic toys. And I think what I got out of this, the biggest takeaway is homeopathy is going to always be difficult because you cannot ignore scientific advances. You can't. You can't put the reductionistic toothpaste back in the tube. And so the two main characters in my research, it really boiled down to Constantine Hering and Adolphus Lippi. And they each represented, it was interesting because they each would consider themselves to be staunchly Hahnemannian. But Hering is Hahnemannian with a scientific twist. And Lippi is really fighting to keep the universal laws in sight. Here's where the historiography tells, as you call it, a porcupine, is that there was a fight. Hering and Lippi had a fight. No, yeah, Al's raising his fists. I don't think they actually duked it out, but they did part ways for a bit.
Yeah, they did.
Well, for a bit, till the end of their lives. They never rekindled their friendship, and they went their separate ways in homeopathy. Hering is a really interesting character because he was advocating for the adoption of new scientific procedures. He was a scientist, and he declared himself a disciple of Hahnemann. And I found it was really interesting because in all the primary source research that I did, it was like, well, how do we know what these people thought? And I would find little bits and bobs along the way. And in the preface, Hering wrote a preface to the third American edition of the Organon, where he says, I am a disciple of Hahnemann. However, Hahnemann would agree with me because he says, test your theories. And even, to the great master, I would say, I only take your theories not at face value, but based on how things play out. Okay, you can say anything, but what you do is really, what's important. And what I kind of came to is that Hering, he was informed by his own life and his experiences, starting from when he had his dissecting injury in 1822. He was writing the refute to homeopathy. He gets this injury from dissecting a suicide victim. He's none of the, allopathic or whatever, the interventions of the time, calomel, leeches, silver nitrate, none of it helped. And so one of his friends, who was a medical doctor but also was really into Hahnemann, says, try this, and gives him a dose of arsenicum, and that cures his dissecting wound. And then he becomes a fanatic. But Hering, when he was in Germany and he was studying medicine, he was studying under people who were experts in pathology. So his medical education is already down the line of pathology. So even though he's taken on homeopathy, he's taken it on through materia medica. I'm not convinced that he's ever fully on board with Hahnemannian philosophy. So it's interesting because fast forward to when Hering and Lippe are both teaching in the Homeopathic Medical College of Pennsylvania, Hering is the philosophy guy. And Lippe is the materia medica guy. But Hering says, if I could, I would devote all my time to Hering's guiding symptoms, because materia medica is where he is. And so it's like nothing is ever clean in history, just like in human life, right? And so what happens is, over the course of time, people pick the bits and bobs, as I had to do in writing my thesis. You pick things that forward your narrative. Well, what was the core issue between the disputes with Hering and Lippe? Well, it has to do with pathology. But because, I want to say it in sort of the shortest and cleanest way possible, but pathology doesn't mean Hering, yes, Lippe, no. But that's the way that people have made it seem. They go, oh, well, Lippe says all you need are the law of similars. You don't need pathology. Okay, so what did people do with that?
In a case.
In a
when
case.
You're analysing a case.
Yeah, but it's not that simple. And he was a medical doctor. And this is where I think people get it wrong, because they use Lippe's argument as a way to say you don't need medical sciences in homeopathy. Just go with the law of similars. Well, similars and homeopathic theory has become stuff that has nothing to do with homeopathy. And so they take it and it's like, everybody's been Lippified. But in reality, they still taught pathology. Even in the year that Hering left to say homeopathy needs to be more scientific or they're going to call you quacks. Yeah. They still taught pathology. They still taught using the textbook of the guy that they fired, Rao, or they didn't technically fire him. He didn't get a chair in pathology. So I don't understand how this argument has been forwarded, right? So what I did was I went in the archives and I went through the announcements of every year of the college, every single year that it existed. And I looked at what were they teaching, who was teaching it, what were the required textbooks, and so on and so forth. And so then I found the letters between Hering and Lippe. Well, it was Hering wrote to Lippe, to Guernsey, and to the delegates of the True Friends of Homeopathy. And what it really comes down to is an interpretation of science in the 19th century. And I think that that's a really interesting argument. And I think that we can't fully understand it without really looking at what was happening in science and how were the proponents of quote unquote science, which is basically allopathic science, it's the reductionistic science. Where were they going?
But isn't it laboratory science?
Yes.
It's about, isn't it about, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I understand it, if there is there had to have been a clear difference of opinion between Lippe and Hering.
Totally.
But it's not about science, I suppose, but it is about the emphasis on what's going on in the patient when we're analysing their case and the reason that they're ill, reason that they've got their problem.
Yeah, it was a more subtle conversation.
Right, and so let's say in science, as you head to the back end of the 19th century, you've got the beginning of laboratory science, blood work, germs, germ theory, and Lippe's saying not interested in that.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
Okay.
And the timing is interesting because it's so it's really super complicated because And this is one of the things that I had to tackle that was very difficult to cross the Muggle line with, and that is there's an arc in the uptake of new information that happens over time. Yeah. So the way that the allopathic arc has been documented through their historiography, which only includes us as a peripheral nuisance, basically. Actually, I shouldn't say that. That's really unfair. Some historians have actually noted that homeopaths were way more scientific. In other words, if science is about reproducible experimentation, that's baked into the cake.
Huh?
But that's not how they looked at it, because they didn't understand how Hahnemann, as an empiricist from day one, his first paper on homeopathy was called The Medicine of Experience, right? That was what, 1796. So, but the way that we find our place in history as scientists is more about institutions, right? Because that's what history was looking at for a long time, was sort of the institutionalization of how science and medicine sort of made their way through the arc of time. And so the way that the history of medicine, which has its own complicated history, which we can't get into, but which was super helpful for me to learn, right? But the history of medicine, looking at the 19th century, says first you sort of come over the hump from the 18th to the 19th century, and everybody is holding on to rational systems. In other words, there wasn't enough sort of technology and understanding to break things apart, and it's still holding on to these Hippocratic ideals. Yeah? So these rational systems were systems that were looking for answers to how things work. Now,
you mean theories on disease?
Not theories on disease, theories on sort of health and well-being, because it was still attached to the Hippocratic thing, right? Because, and this is where it gets really semantically based, yeah? Because so it goes in the allopathic realm, people are holding on to old systems, and then they go, okay, we got to pull away from these systems. How do we do that? We do it at the bedside.
Yep.
By looking at what's happening with the patient, and we become empirical. But this means something different than it does to homeopaths. And this is, of course, what made me bang my head against the wall in the beginning, where I'm writing papers and I'm getting feedback that says, no, you're misunderstanding this. And I'm like, wait, how? Empiricism is X, right? It is the actual experimentation, and I know it as a homeopath. But it didn't happen in allopathic medicine until the early to middle part of the century, as they're letting go of rational systems. And this is when the sort of French bedside medicine is influencing American medical behavior. Okay, then they leave that behind when pathology comes along. That's when it moves into the laboratory, or the laboratory, as you would say. That happens later. Germ theory really happens. So germ theory becomes bacteriology, becomes microbiology. Late 1870s, you've got Pasteur, you've got Koch, you've got Lister, right? And then you pop over to the 20th century, and then it's a whole different ballgame. Okay, now, homeopathy, people say, oh, there were homeopathic hospitals, and they were operating, and everything was great. And then, Flexner comes along. Flexner comes along in 1920. Problems in homeopathy started in 1860, 1870, 1880 for sure. And 1881 is where the huge rift really becomes apparent, because homeopathy had already started to cannibalize itself. It was having its own problems. And it wasn't just, do we adopt pathology? It's much more complicated than that, right?
High potency, low potency, spiritualist, non-spiritualist.
But even if you leave that out, and that's what I chose to do in my paper, was to say, I'm not even going to touch Kent right now. I'm not going to touch the high, low potency, because that was a subsequent argument. And that argument you can almost see as a parallel to uptake of science. Because the high-low argument, so for those who aren't familiar with the high-low argument, it's do you prescribe sort of in the low sort of X potency, so sort of adopting the very basics of homeopathic pharmacology, or do you go into the more, sort of dynamic understandings of potency? That's a real argument, and that was happening both here in America. It was happening in England, which was very interesting. You look at people like Clark, right, and Hughes. But I think a more compelling argument is...
And Burnett.
And Burnett, right? So, and Burnett, I mean, we can't even sort of open that door right now. But what becomes a compelling argument is, if homeopathy wants to be a part of... Well, I was going to say a part of the system. It's not even that. It's that homeopaths don't have a basic understanding and agreement of what we do. And what was so fascinating was, as I started to really deconstruct primary source materials, I found very clear evidence of the mixing of everything that literally resulted in remedies, medicines, for which there's no consistency on who made them, how they made them, or what. And the example that I used in my paper was around, one of the examples was around pyrogenium, septicemia, right? These are remedies that are made from either the byproduct of rotten meat or pus from someone who had gone septic. And then they became interchangeable. Those are not interchangeable substances.
That was really interesting to me because I didn't know that, because I've always gone, pyrogen. Like, when we're going travelling to somewhere, Denise says, don't forget the pyrogen. And, of course, that's a remedy that was made from beef that was left out on the sun or the rain or the whatever.
No, in the sun, in a bag, so that it was creating an anaerobic environment, so that it would become disgusting, literally. But you know how they got to that? And this is, I found this to be, really cool. Homeopaths, a homeopath who's practicing from Hahnemann's idea of similar, not exact, says, my assumptions are analogous. In other words, I'm not becoming reductionistic and isopathic. I am looking to say, what a homeopathic remedy that cures by analogy, right, that is a similar, it doesn't matter what the exciting cause is. So you can get sepsis from a dissecting wound, as I've learned, from a spider bite. You can get it from an infection in the peritoneal cavity. You can get sepsis from an incomplete miscarriage. Right? So there are a whole bunch of different ways. Now, of course, I've traced had to study the history of sepsis, but also the ways that homeopaths interacted with it. So you got one group of homeopaths who said, sepsis, we understand this as in a post-surgical situation, the surgical room, when there's infection, smells like rotten meat. It smells like putrefaction. Therefore, we should have a substance that is putrid.
That creates putrid.
That creates that. And they did. So pyrogenium, made from rotten meat, becomes a remedy for an incomplete abortion, typhoid, septic typhoid, a dissecting wound, anything for which the symptoms match. Okay. What's happening with herring and swan? Yeah? Let's potentize septic blood. That's a totally different animal.
It's quite a... I mean, you can see how the leap happens, but to understand the difference of thinking is really critical, isn't it?
Totally critical. And so what happens? So Swan writes to Herring and says, have you potentized septic blood? And if so, can I get it in the highest potency that you have? Herring writes back and he says, no, I haven't, because septic blood is going to be different depending on the cause of sepsis. However, there's a guy in Chicago, Wormley, who's a chemist. Maybe if we send it to him, he can and now I'm paraphrasing, further reduce it, he can find the commonality in whatever the finest, the most reductionistic way possible. Okay, so that's how Herring wanted to solve the problem of sepsis.
Now, those two remedies, the information has been joined.
Yeah.
That is not good.
No.
No.
Not good at all. I mean, this is, as a person who had sepsis.
Well, as a person that relies on their repertory, as a person that wants to look into materia medica and rely on that seems somewhat speculative and unreliable.
Yep. So, okay. So we got here because we went through the arc of, I started with saying the arc of what happened in allopathic evolution in the 19th century is like, okay, we're going to get away from systems, beginning of the century. We're going to experiment at the bedside, and then, laboratory. Great, right? And what happens toward the end of the century when they get into the laboratory is the terminology changes. So I did this whole sort of philological exploration, which was super fun. And that is looking at the different ways in which words were used over time to track scientific progress. Mm-hmm. So what happened was that it went from natural to normal. Health went from being in a state of nature, being in harmony with nature, to being normal. In other words, matching laboratory results. Now,
I always thought normal was a cycle on the washing machine.
Oh my God.
Anyway.
Oh, this is why I keep you around, honestly.
There's no natural button on the washing machine.
There is not. So this idea, I just want to sort of look at this from current, like where we are now. What happens when a client comes to you and says, my thyroid labs are off? Mm. They have been told that they're out of the range of normal. Mm. My blood pressure is high. My whatever. I mean, and I think when we use examples of the endocrine system is this is where Lippy really comes in handy because he says, you've got to look at the big picture. See, I would consider Lippy to be much more interested in a larger totality when appropriate. He's saying, don't start at the smallest totality. Understand the bigger picture. Now, where it becomes complicated is what happens if you've got old provings, old information about medicines that, based on the amount of knowledge available at the time that they were proved or the language used to describe dysfunction in the body, there isn't a knowledge of the organ affinities. Okay. So I came across case examples. So in addition, I also read all the journals, which was so much fun. Mm. It was really amazing to read the journals and the conversations that were being had in real time as homeopaths debated how to take up this information. And so I can't remember who made this argument, but they were talking about a case where it would have been someone on the Herring side of things said, okay, but you've got the externalization of symptoms and it's, elevated heartbeat and, the auscultation or the listening to the chest cavity, reveals fluid, Well, if it's the heart, it's one set of remedies. If it's the lungs, it's another set of remedies. If the pathology would tell you, is there, examination would tell you that there's a pathological impediment, and you might be prescribing on something for which, you are going at the wrong organ system, or, you're prescribing on the results of the disease as opposed to the organic disease.
Can I give you an example?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's this famous, amazing case. I always teach it when I'm teaching the work of James Compton Burnett. Yeah. And it's the case of it's I think a 40-year-old man, 50-year-old man, with a tumour that went from his left nipple to the hip, and some massive tumour creating a whole lot of other symptoms. And at the end of he writes really beautifully. Seven physicians, mainly from Guy's Hospital, had attended the patient, and had basically said, "No, we're done." And so, through physical examination and through his knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and at that time,
because he was a master anatomist,
he changed the focus of the treatment, and the client got in alternation, which Burnett also said it was a mistake, but I was desperate and had nothing else to do. I gave Ballus perennis because he'd had a fall 10 years before on this side, but additionally he got Ceanothus 1X.
Wow.
And so it was alternating Ballus perennis, Ceanothus, massively low potencies.
Right.
And then over the next 4 or 5 months, he just started to urinate. He was urinating gallons and gallons and gallons as the tumour shrunk.
Wow.
All of the skin peels off of his hands. He starts to sit upright in bed. He's able to walk. And gradually, it's not a straight line. There's a skin rash that comes along as well. And, but an astonishing transformation and restoration of health through that. And so he was saying, but if I'd followed the fact that he had heart palpitations, if I just followed the symptoms, I would have been prescribing digitalis, or I would have been prescribing cactus, or one of the heart remedies,
exactly,
which was a feature of the case at the time, but I didn't, because it was from the spleen, and it was from the fall, full stop.
It's so important, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
And so what that teaches us is we have to be really considerate of the adoption of new knowledge, and we have to figure out how it fits into what is ultimately an amazing system.
You know
right?
what it makes me think?
What?
We've got to push back against the students that say, "Oh, why do we have to learn anatomy and physiology? Oh my God, 94 hours." It's like, are you kidding me?
I mean, I would have done anything to be able to have appropriate homeopathic medical education, which, by the way, was the way that education was delivered. I mean, I've got all, going through and looking at all of those books. I mean, they all learned surgery and, chemistry and all of that. Now, interestingly, at one point in Philadelphia, there were 2 hospitals. Yeah. You remember I was telling you last night in the limitations section of my paper. So when you're writing, a thesis, you say, okay, this is everything that I've done. What else would I have done if I had more time or, whatever? And I said, what I would have loved would have been to look at the 2 homeopathic hospitals, one of which followed sort of the Herring way that became Hahnemann Hospital that existed up until they took the sign down recently. There was a Lippe Hospital, which you hear very little about. I didn't even know about. There's a brief mention in Julian Winston. He says that was talked about in the newspapers at the time. It was a big conversation. I searched and I was unable to find anything in the newspapers, which I will continue to look for. But that hospital was utilizing what we would now consider to be best practices in the care of the body, not just the homeopathic remedies, right? But good food, ventilation, all of the supportive things. What I did find was in the homeopathic journals, the Women's Auxiliary that raised the money for that hospital, they were talking about how hard it was to get nurses and doctors who were A, trained in homeopathy appropriately, and B, wanted to continue on with that care and not sort of get all of the newest modern training. Like they were getting all the training that they needed to be a really good homeopathic physician or nurse, but not, whatever the latest bells and whistles were. And so it's interesting that the organization that went on into modernity was
the scientific one.
Was the scientific one that just adopted all the new things that ultimately became a lead. Hahnemann Hospital was a leader in a variety of medical things. I can't remember, something to do with the kidneys. That's not my area of expertise anyway, but that was really super interesting to see. And I would have loved to have really gotten into patient records in each of those hospitals to see what what were the homeopaths doing at the bedside?
You were going deep down that rabbit hole. Wow.
I think that would be fascinating. Right?
Great. Yeah. Why is this relevant? What's the meaning for us?
I mean, the more I learn about homeopathy, and, this, of course, we're now talking about my, 4 years in the Muggle world.
After you were 25 years in the...
Well, my other, my real love, and what I'm going back to now in my research, which I already started again yesterday, as soon as I was done, was like reading some of the old stuff, which is how did Hahnemann get to where he did? Because I think if we could really understand homeopathy better, and if we could adopt the appropriate innovations, technological and medical innovations, we can really change medicine. And as I look at all of the different ways homeopathy is being taught, through and no fault of the people who are, teaching it, because I think about all the things that I've taught that I know, now that I've sort of learned more, I'm like, wow, there's a much more nuanced approach needed. I think we will do better to understand what homeopathy is and was meant to be. Mm-hmm. So my research that goes back into Hahnemann's, discoveries, so going back to the 8th century Islamic, chemistry, and coming forward, and then, where my thesis took off was around Hahnemann's death and sort of post-Hahnemannian homeopathy, and looking at, America as the place where homeopathy was meant to really thrive, right? The new medicine for the new world. And what did we do that set it off its path? What can we do now that here we are in the 21st century, where I would argue homeopathy is needed much more than ever? Autoimmune disease and all of these ways in which the reductionistic paradigm does not work, right? How can we then say, okay, good, this is Lippy's moment. This is Lippy's moment. How can we then take from all of the advances to really work with homeopathy as it was meant to be, and not to create something brand new? I mean, what I see happening when we get, students who have studied in other interpretations of homeopathy, or even more clients we get in our teaching clinic who have been given 10 million nosodes, prescribed according to a reductionistic isopathic paradigm. It's just not homeopathy. Homeo detox, detoxing for every vaccine and drug a person is taking. It's not homeopathy. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's isopathy, somethingopathy.
Somethingopathy. And I just see its incredible relevance right now. Because I think, looking around, the debates around the relevance of the use of nosodes and isopathy have always been around, but not in the way that they have been in more recent times, with the astonishing bombardment of patients, clients that we're seeing in our clinic. When what is it that there was a kid that came that was 3 years old, having had 75 remedies, 18 months or something.
18 months old, more than 70 remedies. People were turning up with spreadsheets. The hardest cases in my practice are people who have been given nosode after nosode after nosode after nosode after nosode. These detoxification protocols that we have no evidence. There is no clinical evidence as to how this works.
Can I tell you what came across my desk yesterday? And it is, I'm a part of a study that's going on in Australia at the moment.
Are you now?
I am. And the study is around traditional evidence, traditional medicine, and it's part of a very interesting broader strategy of linking homeopathy to traditional, quote, traditional medicine. You know that traditional, the homeopathy is actually classified with the World Health Organization as part of the, it's because there's no real classification for complementary medicine. We're part of traditional medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this interesting process going on at the moment of trying to create a structure that not only defines traditional medicine, but speaks about how it's can be implemented, how it can be articulated, how it can be relevant in different social contexts and different cultures and stuff.
But would you put homeopathy in the category of traditional medicine?
Right now, yeah, I would. Exactly. And here's why. Well, there's a bunch of reasons why. I can't quite remember all of the categories. But traditional medicine, you'd think about, say, traditional Maori people in New Zealand.
Right, that's exactly. Aboriginal medicine or native.
That's right, or Mongolian shamanism or Tibetan medicine. And you'd go, well, hang on, no, it's not, because it's Western German 19th century medicine. And from a historical point of view, and it's a Western medicine from a geographical point of view. But of course its application is incredibly broad. But the point is that traditional medicine relies on an authority. It relies on a historical authority, which is passed on down the line. And I started to think about this, and I'll leave it there because it's just kind of fermenting away. But I wonder if considering that the application of homeopathy as a traditional medicine is defined by those things that are relevant for traditional medicine, I think it could be a way forward for us.
I'm going to have to think about that, because there are parts of it that don't make sense. Because what came to my mind as you started talking about it is that it comes down to the definition of science. Because because I think about, so there's a way in which, and maybe I still just have a historian's brain on, which I need to sort of shake the dust out of that a little bit.
Yeah.
But, there's sort of this way in which medicine has been bifurcated into sort of orthodox and heterodox, meaning orthodox, allopathic, science, and then everything else. And homeopaths have been put in the everything else category, when in reality, well, I don't know. I can actually think of a few. I could come at it from a few different perspectives. So
Let's come back to that.
I think we should.
Time. Here's what I've taken, my big takeaway. The title of our next book: Homeopathy, a Peripheral Nuisance. Genius.
A peripheral nuisance?
That's what you said.
Did I say that?
Came out of your mouth.
Really?
You don't even know you said that, do you?
No, not at all.
You were channeling.
Apparently. That's really good.
It's really good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Will you don't let me forget that.
No, I'm going to write it down straight away.
Please do.
All right.
That's hilarious. I think we're done. My coffee's getting cold.
Yeah, we are kind of done.
Put a fork in me.
I've really enjoyed this. Can I just also say that you've not even mentioned the which is definitely for another time, but I want you to talk at length on a part of your discovery around now the new historiography of the history of medicine, and especially Herring in particular with the use of the early nosodes. You've not mentioned that.
Oh, right, I hadn't.
No,
spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
We were way ahead of the game.
I know.
All right.
So, it's good to be back on the horse. All right, that's it. Take care, folks. We'll
do it again.
I know. And look, apologies for our 2-week hiatus.
Was it really 2 weeks?
It was 2 weeks. I feel bereft. All right. Done.
Hey there. My name is Kaylee, and I'm a graduate of the Academy of Homeopathy Education. As a homeschooling mother of young children, I wanted to find a way that I could pursue my dream of becoming a professional homeopath. The faculty at AHE welcomed me with open arms and helped me find my path. If you've been waiting for a sign to apply, this is it. AHE is offering an early enrollment discount to help you get started. Learn more at ahe.online.